In the mid-1800s, Tennessee stood at a crossroads between tradition and transformation. The land was being reshaped by expanding farms, growing settlements, and the steady push of the American frontier toward the west. Newspapers of the era focused on prosperity, harvest yields, and migration routes. They painted a picture of progress and optimism, suggesting that the future was being built layer by layer upon the soil. Yet beneath this visible story of development, something far more unsettling was waiting in silence, buried deep within the earth. In 1845, on farmland owned by William Shumate in White County, a group of workers was assigned a routine task. The farm required a reliable water source, and the solution was simple: dig a well. Wells were common across rural America, and the laborers expected nothing more than dirt, rocks, and eventually groundwater. There was no anticipation of discovery, no sense of historical importance. It was manual labor performed for survival and productivity. The digging began as expected. Shovels cut through soft topsoil, then denser layers of clay and sediment. As the pit deepened, the workers noticed that water still had not appeared. Most wells in the region reached the water table within 20 to 30 feet. Yet they continued past 40 feet, then 45, driven by necessity and instruction. The depth alone was becoming unusual, but no one imagined what lay below. At nearly 50 feet beneath the surface, a shovel struck something solid. At first, it was assumed to be stone or perhaps an old tree root preserved underground. The men cleared away more soil, working carefully. What emerged was pale and curved, smooth in texture and unmistakably organic. It was a bone. More digging revealed another, then another. Slowly, a larger structure took shape. The workers realized they were uncovering a skeleton. But this was not the skeleton of any ordinary person. Each bone was enormous. The proportions were familiar, unmistakably human, yet scaled far beyond anything they had ever seen. As more of the remains were exposed, disbelief spread among the crew. A femur longer than a man's arm. Ribs thick enough to resemble wooden beams. Vertebrae that seemed carved from stone. And finally, a skull of staggering size, large enough, witnesses later claimed, to fit over a grown man's head like a helmet. The skeleton appeared intact, arranged in proper anatomical order. It had not been scattered by animals or disturbed by erosion. It lay as though deliberately placed, suggesting intentional burial. If reconstructed, the body would have stood between 18 and 20 feet tall. Such measurements contradicted every known principle of human biology. Word traveled quickly through nearby towns. Farmers, merchants, and families began arriving to see the excavation. Many stood silently at the edge of the pit, staring downward in confusion and awe. Some crossed themselves. Others argued over explanations. Was it an ancient warrior? A biblical giant? A freak of nature? Local newspapers soon reported the story. Headlines described an unprecedented discovery. Journalists recorded measurements, interviewed witnesses, and published sketches. They noted the extraordinary depth of burial and the completeness of the remains. Unlike rumors or legends, this discovery was physical, visible, and accessible. As interest grew, the skeleton was carefully removed from the pit and transported for public display. It was exhibited in a local theater, where visitors paid admission to view what became known as the Tennessee Giant. Crowds lined up for weeks. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, saw the bones with their own eyes. Visitors described feeling small and insignificant beside the towering remains. Some felt excitement. Others felt unease. Many left with more questions than answers. Doctors, educators, and amateur scholars examined the skeleton and debated its origins. Some suggested rare genetic disorders. Others proposed misidentified animal fossils. A few admitted openly that they had no explanation. One troubling detail persisted: the burial depth. 50 feet underground suggested immense age or deliberate interment under extraordinary circumstances. Normal burial practices could not account for such placement. The layers above the skeleton implied centuries of accumulated sediment. This raised questions about when the individual had lived and who had buried them. For a brief period, it seemed the discovery would become a cornerstone of American archaeology. Officials documented the site. Scholars requested access. Articles continued to circulate. Everything pointed toward serious investigation. Then, abruptly, the momentum ended. The exhibition closed without clear explanation. The skeleton was removed from public view. Reports slowed. Discussions faded. No official scientific publication followed. No museum announced permanent acquisition. No preserved specimen appeared in national collections. Within months, the Tennessee giant had vanished. Only newspaper clippings, fading memories, and unanswered questions remained. What had been uncovered at 50 feet beneath a quiet farm had briefly disrupted accepted history. It had challenged assumptions about the past and hinted at something unknown. And just as quickly as it emerged, it was gone, leaving behind a mystery that would echo through generations. As the story of the Tennessee discovery began to fade from public memory, similar reports quietly continued to surface across other parts of the United States. What initially seemed like an isolated curiosity slowly revealed itself as part of a much larger and more disturbing pattern. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, newspapers, private letters, and regional records documented repeated discoveries of unusually large human remains in multiple states. These findings did not occur in one small region or within a short time span. They appeared over decades, scattered across hundreds of miles, yet shared remarkably similar characteristics. In Kentucky, farmers plowing new fields uncovered massive bones buried deep beneath fertile soil. In Ohio, construction crews digging near ancient earthworks reported skeletons far larger than normal. In Indiana and Illinois, workers expanding railroads and canals encountered skulls and femurs that defied known measurements. In West Virginia and Pennsylvania, miners and surveyors described uncovering oversized remains within old burial chambers. Each discovery followed a familiar sequence: initial excitement, brief newspaper coverage, public curiosity, and then gradual disappearance. Many of these finds were closely linked to ancient burial mounds. These mounds, numbering in the thousands, dotted the landscapes of the Ohio Valley, Mississippi Basin, and Great Lakes region. Built long before European settlement, they represented some of the largest prehistoric construction projects in North America. Some rose dozens of feet high. Others formed complex geometric patterns visible only from above. Early explorers marveled at their precision and scale. Within these structures, investigators frequently encountered human remains. Most matched normal proportions. But in numerous cases, skeletons were reported to be far larger. Some measured 7 to 9 feet, already exceeding known averages. Others were said to reach 12 feet or more. While the most extreme measurements were disputed, the repeated appearance of oversized remains could not be ignored. Early archaeologists and surveyors took these discoveries seriously. Detailed field notes described bone dimensions, burial positions, and surrounding artifacts. Some skeletons were found seated upright. Others lay within stone-lined chambers. Grave goods such as tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects suggested organized cultural practices. These were not random burials. They reflected deliberate ritual and social structure. Private correspondence between researchers of the era reveals growing uncertainty. Letters preserved in university archives describe giant races, abnormal populations, and unexplained skeletal forms. Some scholars openly admitted that existing theories could not account for what they were observing. Others urged caution, fearing ridicule or professional damage. Federal institutions also became involved. Early museums and government repositories received numerous skeletal specimens from field expeditions. Inventory records mention large human remains and unusual skeletons. Some internal reports noted exceptional size and weight. At the time, these collections were considered valuable research material. Yet as decades passed, these specimens became increasingly difficult to trace. Modern researchers searching museum archives often encounter incomplete catalogs. Entries reference items that no longer exist. Storage boxes are empty. Labels remain without contents. In some cases, only vague descriptions survive. The physical bones themselves are missing. At the same time, public reporting underwent a noticeable shift. In the early 19th century, newspaper articles were descriptive and precise. They listed measurements, quoted witnesses, and published illustrations. By the late 1800s, the language grew cautious. Reports shortened. Numbers disappeared. Terms like unusual replaced enormous. Large replaced giant. By the early 20th century, most such stories vanished altogether. Another significant development was the growing restriction of excavation sites. Many mound complexes were placed under protection, officially to preserve indigenous heritage. This decision was ethically necessary and remains important today. However, some researchers noticed a pattern. Sites associated with anomalous discoveries were often among the first to be closed. Deep digging was discouraged. Access was limited. Independent investigations became rare. As academic disciplines matured, standardized frameworks emerged. Anthropology, archaeology, and human biology established clear models for human development and migration. These models left little room for unknown populations of extraordinary size. Anomalous findings were reclassified as measurement errors, misidentified animal bones, or exaggerated folklore. Textbooks reflected this shift. Early accounts were omitted. Controversial discoveries were ignored. The narrative became streamlined and consistent. Yet beneath this polished framework, unresolved questions remained. Why were oversized remains found repeatedly in similar contexts? Why were they often associated with monumental earthworks? Why did institutional records acknowledge their existence while modern collections contain nothing? Why did documentation become increasingly vague over time? Some scholars proposed practical explanations. Poor preservation methods may have destroyed fragile bones. Limited funding may have prevented proper storage. Misclassification may have led to disposal. These factors certainly played a role, but they did not fully explain the scale of disappearance. Entire categories of material seemed to vanish. Multiple institutions reported losses. Different regions displayed the same gaps. The pattern suggested something more than isolated accidents. Whether through neglect, reclassification, or quiet removal, evidence that did not fit established theories gradually faded from view. No official decision was ever announced. No public statement acknowledged suppression. Instead, the process unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, over generations. By the time modern researchers began questioning the absence, the trail had grown cold. What remained were fragments of testimony preserved in newspapers, journals, and private letters. Together, they formed a shadow archive of discoveries that once challenged accepted history but were later pushed aside. The Tennessee giant, once thought unique, now appeared as part of a continent-wide phenomenon. It was not an anomaly, but a representative of a broader pattern, one that briefly surfaced in the 19th century before being quietly absorbed into silence. And as the evidence faded, so too did the willingness to ask why. By the beginning of the 20th century, the pattern surrounding giant skeletal discoveries in North America had become unmistakable. Reports that once filled newspaper columns had nearly disappeared. Public exhibitions had ended. Academic discussions had grown cautious and limited. What had once been treated as extraordinary evidence was now dismissed as misunderstanding or folklore. The transition was not sudden or dramatic. It unfolded quietly, through years of omission, reinterpretation, and institutional silence. One of the most striking aspects of this transformation was the disappearance of physical evidence. In science, material proof is everything. Without specimens, theories cannot be tested, verified, or challenged. Yet in the case of the oversized skeletons reported throughout the 19th century, the bones themselves were gone. Museums that once acknowledged receiving large remains could no longer produce them. University collections contained references without objects. Government repositories listed acquisitions that no longer existed. Some curators explained these losses by pointing to poor preservation techniques. Early museums lacked climate control, proper storage materials, and conservation knowledge. Bones exposed to moisture, insects, and temperature fluctuations could deteriorate rapidly. Fires, floods, and relocations destroyed many early collections. These explanations were reasonable but incomplete. Normal human skeletons from the same period survived in large numbers. Fossils millions of years old remained intact. Yet the most controversial specimens consistently vanished. The selective nature of the losses raised difficult questions. Alongside physical disappearance came the erosion of documentation. Early field reports, detailed sketches, and precise measurements became harder to find. Some archives were reorganized. Others were partially destroyed. In many cases, original documents were condensed into brief summaries that removed key details. Numbers were replaced with general descriptions. Extraordinary features were softened into neutral language. Where early records spoke of towering skeletons and massive skulls, Later publications referred only to abnormally large remains. Where witnesses once described men standing inside skull cavities, official reports avoided mention altogether. Over time, this revised language became the standard reference. Future researchers relied on sanitized summaries rather than original accounts. As generations passed, the earlier descriptions came to be viewed as unreliable exaggerations. Institutional culture played an important role in this process. Scientific disciplines depend on shared frameworks. These frameworks guide funding, education, and professional advancement. Evidence that challenges foundational assumptions creates instability. It forces scholars to reconsider theories built over decades. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, anthropology was constructing a unified narrative of human migration into North America. This narrative emphasized gradual development, known populations, and predictable biological limits. Giant skeletons threatened that structure. Accepting them as genuine would have required major revisions. Where did these people come from? Why were they so large? Why did they vanish? How did they relate to known cultures? Such questions had no easy answers. Without strong supporting evidence, pursuing them carried professional risk. Researchers who insisted on controversial interpretations risked isolation and ridicule. As a result, many chose caution. Over time, controversial material was quietly set aside. Not destroyed publicly. Not debated openly. Simply ignored. Another factor was legal and ethical regulation. As awareness of indigenous rights grew, many burial sites were protected. This was an essential and necessary development. However, it also limited further investigation of certain locations where anomalous remains had been reported. Once sites were closed, opportunities for verification vanished. Meanwhile, public interest shifted. New scientific discoveries, industrial growth, and global conflicts captured attention. Stories of 19th-century giants seemed irrelevant. Without physical evidence, they became curiosities rather than serious subjects. By the mid-20th century, the idea of giant human remains in North America was largely confined to fringe literature and popular myths. Mainstream scholarship dismissed it as pseudoscience. Few academics were willing to revisit the original sources. Yet those sources still exist. Old newspapers preserved on microfilm. Private letters stored in forgotten boxes. Field journals hidden in university basements. Government correspondence buried in archives. Together, they form a fragmented record of something that once demanded explanation. The burial mounds remain as well. Thousands of them still rise from forests, fields, and riverbanks. Many are protected. Many remain unexcavated. Beneath them lie layers of history that modern researchers approach with caution and respect. What lies below is largely unknown. It may contain nothing unusual. It may confirm existing theories. Or it may reveal evidence that challenges them. We cannot know because much of it remains unexplored. The story of the Tennessee giant and its counterparts is not proof of a lost race of giants. It is not confirmation of hidden civilizations. It is something more subtle and perhaps more unsettling. It is evidence of how knowledge can be shaped, how inconvenient data can fade, how narratives become fixed, how uncertainty is managed. History is not only written by those who win wars. It is written by institutions that decide what matters, what is preserved, and what is forgotten. Over time, these decisions accumulate into official memory. The 19th century briefly opened a window into something unexplained. Workers uncovered bones that did not fit accepted categories. Newspapers recorded what people saw. Institutions took possession of evidence. And then, slowly, the window closed. Whether through neglect, caution, or deliberate avoidance, the physical traces disappeared. What remained were questions without answers. Today, when we look back, we are left with a puzzle assembled from fragments. No definitive proof. No definitive refutation. Only patterns, silences, and shadows. Perhaps the giant skeletons were errors, misinterpretations, or rare anomalies exaggerated by time. Or perhaps they represented something genuinely unknown. Without evidence, certainty is impossible. But one truth remains. For a brief moment in the 19th century, the ground revealed something that unsettled accepted history. Instead of reshaping understanding, it was quietly absorbed into obscurity. Beneath the soil, beneath the mounds, beneath the foundations of modern America, layers of untold history remain. waiting, unexamined, and perhaps deliberately forgotten.